Okay, picture a world map from, say, 1900. What do you see? It's basically just a sea of sprawling empires, right? Now, fast forward just a few decades, and that same map is totally redrawn. It's packed with dozens of new independent nations. So in this explainer, we're going to dig into how this absolutely massive transformation actually happened. And that's really the big question, isn't it? How did this happen so fast? I mean, how did so many countries break free from colonial rule in what was, historically speaking, the blink of an eye? Well, it turns out there wasn't just one simple answer. When we really break it down, two major paths to freedom emerge. The first one was paved with things like treaties and protests, a struggle won through political pressure and, good old-fashioned diplomacy. The other path? Well, that one was forged in fire. Freedom seized through brutal, drawn-out wars and rebellions. So let's start with that first path, the path of negotiation. This is where we see how the power of protest and sheer political will could, believe it or not, prove stronger than imperial control. So when you look at India, its path to independence really wasn't a sprint, it was a marathon. I mean, the whole movement for self-rule started way back in the 19th century with political groups like the Indian National Congress. Then decades later, you have leaders like Mohandas Gandhi, who just galvanized millions through mass civil disobedience. But you know what the final straw was for a Britain already weakened by war? The Royal Indian Navy revolt in 1946. That was the signal. It was a clear sign that their control was crumbling, and boom, just 1 year later, independence was declared. Now, let's contrast that with Ghana, because it tells a really different story. Unlike India's long march, Ghana's path was much faster, and it really picked up steam after World War II. Through negotiations led by the UN, it became the very first sub-Saharan African nation to gain independence. And its first president, Kwame Nkrumah, was a true visionary. He championed this idea of Pan-Africanism, a unified and independent Africa, and later founded the Organization of African Unity. And, this negotiated model played out all across the continent. In French West Africa, which included places like Senegal and the Ivory Coast, France used what they called indirect rule, basically governing through existing local chiefs. But here's the twist. This very system accidentally created a new class of local leaders who, by the 1950s, were forming their own political parties and successfully negotiating for their independence. But for a lot of colonies, the path to freedom wasn't paved with treaties at all. It was a path forged in fire. Just look at Algeria. For them, independence was never going to be negotiated. It was seized in an incredibly violent 8-year-long war. France was absolutely determined to hold on, and the conflict, led by Algeria's National Liberation Front, or FLN, was just marked by extreme brutality on both sides. In fact, the war became so divisive it almost tore France itself apart before President Charles de Gaulle finally agreed to grant independence. And Vietnam is a perfect example of how a fight for independence could get swept up into something way bigger. What started as a pretty straightforward anti-colonial war against France, led by Ho Chi Minh, well, it morphed into a major Cold War battleground. The U.S. jumped in to back South Vietnam against the Communist North, and that led to a devastating war that lasted for decades and ultimately ended with a unified communist Vietnam. But here's the thing you have to remember. It didn't matter how independence was won. The struggle was far from over. In fact, a whole new set of brutal challenges was just beginning. This quote right here really captures the core problem of the whole era. Winning freedom was the first battle. Okay, great. But the even harder battle, the next one, was building a stable, prosperous nation out of the incredibly complicated mess that empire left behind. And Nigeria is just a tragic, stark example of this very problem. Think about it. Imperial borders were drawn by outsiders with absolutely no regard for the people actually living there. So suddenly, you have incredibly diverse ethnic and religious groups forced into one single state. In the north, you had the mostly Islamic House of Fulani, and then in the southeast, the mostly Christian Igbo. Well, these divisions, which were basically baked in during the colonial era, eventually just exploded into the brutal Biafran Civil War in 1967, when the Igbo tried to break away. On top of these internal conflicts, new nations also found themselves caught right in the middle of a massive global power struggle, the Cold War. The 1956 Suez Crisis is a perfect example. When Egypt's President Nasser nationalized the canal, Britain and France invaded to take it back. But then, and this is the key part, both the United States and the Soviet Union condemned the invasion, forcing them to withdraw. It was a crystal clear sign that the old colonial powers were not in charge anymore. Internally, a lot of these new nations really struggled with how to govern themselves. A pretty common outcome was the one-party state, where a single party just held all the power. We saw this with Kwame Nkrumah in Ghana and with the FLN in Algeria. It was seen as a way to force unity, but it often came at the cost of democracy. And listen, these tough questions about national identity weren't just happening in newly independent states in Africa and Asia. They were popping up everywhere. Even in an established country like Canada, the French-speaking province of Quebec saw this huge surge of nationalist feeling in the 1960s. They called it the Quiet Revolution, and it sparked a powerful movement pushing for complete separation. So, okay, we've looked at all of these different paths and all these different problems. But why does this history really matter for us, right now, today? So what's the big picture here? What's the story of decolonization in a nutshell? Well, it's a story of different goals, everything from just a little more autonomy to full-blown independence. It's a story of two totally different paths, one of talk, the other of war. And, maybe most importantly, it's a story with a lasting legacy, because those artificial borders drawn by empires, they're still fueling tensions that many nations are grappling with to this very day. And that leaves us with one final, really powerful question to think about. The goal was always independence, but as the aftermath shows us so clearly, gaining sovereignty is one thing. The struggle to figure out what it truly means to be free, well, that's a journey that, for many nations, is still unfolding.